There are moments in sports that don't make the highlight reels. They don't happen on a court. They don't involve a racket or a net or a scoreboard. They happen in a hallway or in an interview chair or on a social media caption at a very specific moment. And sometimes those moments say more about who someone really is than 20 years of championship tennis ever could. This is one of those moments. Rafael Nadal picked up a racket for the first time in exactly 1 year. 1 year to the day since he walked off a court in Malaga with tears in his eyes and the weight of a career that rewrote what it means to compete. He could have practiced with anyone, a former pro, a current top tenor, a hitting partner from his academy. Instead, he walked onto the court at the Rafa Nadal Academy in Mallorca, looked across the net, and nodded at a 20-year-old Filipino girl from Quezon City who had been training at his school since she was 13 years old. That wasn't an accident. Nothing Nadal does ever is. Let's go back before we go forward, because you can't understand what's happening right now without understanding what these two men meant to each other and to the sport they carried for more than 2 decades. Roger Federer and Rafael Nadal didn't just compete, they constructed a rivalry so complete, so philosophically opposing, that it divided the tennis world into camps the way religion or politics divides people. You were either one or the other, you chose a side before you knew why. Federer was everything the word elegant was made for: fluid movement, effortless shot making, the kind of player who made tennis look like a performance. When he hit a backhand, you forgot it was sport. For a moment, it was art. Nadal was the opposite principle made flesh. Where Federer glided, Nadal ground. Where Federer painted, Nadal dug. He turned a tennis court into a construction site and built points from nothing, from positions that should have been losing positions, from moments where everyone watching had already decided the point was over. He was relentless. That's the only word that really fits. They played 40 times. Nadal leads the head-to-head 24-16. But statistics, as always, missed the point entirely. What existed between these two men was something rarer than a rivalry. It was mutual recognition, the kind that only happens when two people understand that the other is the reason they got better. When Federer said Nadal made him a better player, he wasn't giving a press conference answer. He meant it. And Nadal, who does not say things he does not mean, returned that sentiment every time he was asked. Federer retired in 2022. Nadal followed in 2024, his final match, a Davis Cup tie in Malaga, playing for Spain one last time. The crowd understood what they were watching, so did Nadal. The tears gave it away. And when icons retire, the tennis world always asks the same question: who's next? The answer, it turned out, wasn't one person, it was two. And they weren't supposed to become a problem, but that's exactly what happened. Roger Federer found his answer in João Fonseca, an 18-year-old Brazilian who plays with the kind of self-assurance that usually takes a decade to develop. Federer didn't just admire him from a distance, he signed him to On Running, the Swiss sportswear brand Federer co-owns, and promoted him as the kind of player who could carry the sport forward. Fonseca won the US Open Junior Championship in 2023 and backed that up by reaching the second round of the 2025 Australian Open, defeating Andrei Rublev on the way. He is the real thing, that part isn't in question. Rafael Nadal's answer had been in development for much longer and in a much quieter way. Alexandra Eala first arrived at the Rafa Nadal Academy in Mallorca at 13 years old. Left-handed, technically gifted, from the Philippines, a country that had never produced a professional tennis player at the top level of the sport. She had a work rate that matched the academy's philosophy perfectly. Coaches noticed it early. Nadal noticed it too, though publicly. He let her career speak before he spoke about it. She won the US Open girls singles title in 2022. She went on to win her first WTA singles title in 2025, becoming the first Filipino player in history to do so. She broke into the top 100, then the top 50. By the end of 2025, she was ranked number 50 in the world, with a career high that reflected not just ability but nerve, the kind of nerve you can't coach and can't fake. Two chosen ones, two legends, each believing in their person. And for a while it stayed parallel, inspiring, even. The narrative had a symmetry to it. Federer's guy and Nadal's girl, both ascending, both carrying the hopes of their mentors into a new era of the sport. Then 2025 happened, and symmetry gave way to something messier. You have to understand how Eala's 2025 unfolded to understand why the noise around her name became what it became. It started in Miami. She wasn't supposed to be a story there. She was a qualifier, a young player making her way through the draw, the kind of run that rarely survives long enough to become a headline. But she kept winning. She beat Madison Keys. She went deep. She reached the semi-finals of a WTA 1000 event, and in doing so she became the first Filipino player in history to reach that stage at that level. The Miami Filipino community erupted, and through phones, social media, and a 7,000-island archipelago staying up through the night to watch, so did an entire country. The images of supporters in the stands draped in Philippine flags watching every single point like their own heartbeat depended on it. Those images traveled far beyond the tennis world. Then came the US Open, a tight third set, a a contested line call, a chair umpire reviewing video replay on a match point, a packed stadium holding its breath. Eala survived it. She won her first Grand Slam main draw match. She fell to the court in shock, and for a moment the entire tennis world watched something happen that wasn't about rankings or statistics or prize money. It was about a person finding out what they were made of in the biggest possible moment and rising to meet it. A seasoned Dubai referee who worked some of the greatest matches in the sport's modern era, courts where Federer, Djokovic, Nadal, and Agassi had all stood, said he had never experienced anything quite like the energy of Eala's matches. He described it as different in nature, more pressing, more alive. Ticket sales for the 2026 Dubai Tennis Championships reportedly rose 48% year-over-year, with Eala's presence cited as a primary driver. Former professional Steve Johnson, speaking on the Nothing Major podcast, was asked whether Eala had become the main attraction in women's tennis. He didn't pause, he just answered. Fonseca was doing everything right. He was working, developing, improving, but the spotlight, that particular kind of bright and undeniable spotlight, had moved, and it hadn't moved based on marketing or media strategy or deliberate positioning. It had moved because a 20-year-old from Quezon City had beaten top 10 players, reached semi-finals of majors, and created something in those stands that tournament directors and television executives don't know how to manufacture. You can't script what happened, which is exactly why some people found it uncomfortable. In late 2025, Roger Federer sat down for a lengthy interview ahead of his induction into the International Tennis Hall of Fame scheduled for 2026. The conversation was warm and reflective, the kind of retrospective that a career like his deserves. They talked about Wimbledon, they talked about rivalries, they talked about his transition away from the sport, and then someone mentioned the next generation. Federer lit up when Fonseca's name came up. Genuine affection, genuine pride. Then the interviewer introduced the name Alex Eala into the conversation. What followed was not a shouted accusation. It was not an emotional tirade. What Federer offered was something more calculated and in some ways more pointed because of it. He suggested carefully, diplomatically, but clearly, that certain emerging talents had struggled to receive the recognition they deserved because of the disproportionate media coverage being directed at one particular player, that there was an imbalance, that equally worthy players, and here the implication toward Fonseca was unmistakable, were being overlooked in favor of someone whose profile had grown, in his framing, through what he called a phenomenon of nationalism rather than tennis merit. The clip spread before the interview even finished airing. The phrase nationalism rather than tennis merit was extracted, sharpened, and launched across platforms at a speed that made context irrelevant. 10 million interactions, comment sections became contested territory. People who had spent 20 years praising Federer's grace and sportsmanship found themselves asking whether they'd misread him. Filipino tennis fans, already the most organized and passionate fan community in the sport, mobilized with the efficiency of people who have done this before. Everyone was waiting for someone from the tennis world to respond, not to the fans, not to the media, but to the framing itself. The suggestion that a young woman's achievements were culturally inflated, that her rise was more about flags in the stands than talent on the court. The person who responded was Rafael Nadal, November 19, 2025. Exactly 1 year after Nadal's last professional match in Malaga, he returned to the Rafael Nadal Academy in Mallorca and picked up a racket. His first practice partner on his return to a tennis court was Alexandra Eala, world number 50. The photo he posted was simple, the two of them on court. The caption read, "1 year later, it felt great to be back on a tennis court. Practicing with you, Alex Eala, was fantastic. I'll be tougher next time." Eala responded, "Back like you never left." Read those words in the context of everything that was happening around her name at that exact moment. Because Nadal is not a man who posts things without knowing what he's posting. He spent 2 decades choosing every shot with intention. He approaches everything else the same way. He didn't write a statement. He didn't call a press conference. He didn't address Federer by name. He went to a tennis court, practiced with the person at the center of the controversy, put it on social media, and let the image speak. When pressed in a follow-up interview to address the comments that had circulated regarding young players and media coverage imbalance, Nadal did not dodge. "Any athlete who brings new people to the sport should be celebrated, not questioned," he said. "The passion of supporters does not diminish tennis. It is its lifeblood," he continued. "I have watched Alex work for years. The size of a fan base should not be confused with an absence of merit." And then, with the kind of precision that made him the greatest clay court player in the history of the sport, "My friendship with Roger is excellent. We speak regularly, a door left open, a relationship preserved, and not a single step backward. Here is where we have to be honest, because real conversations about real things require honesty." Was everything Federer said completely without foundation? João Fonseca is exceptional. He is technically gifted, mentally mature for his age, and possesses the physical tools to compete at the highest level for the next 15 years. The argument that he deserves more attention is not an unreasonable argument on its face, And it is fair to note that the cultural fervor surrounding Eala has sometimes created a media environment where the gap between her current ranking and the coverage she receives is noticeable. Early losses have triggered disproportionate backlash from newer, more emotionally reactive fans who don't yet have the context that comes from following the sport long-term. Eala herself has been unflinching about this. After a 6-0, 6-2 loss to Coco Gauff in Dubai, she didn't reach for excuses or hide behind the scale of her following. "I still have a long way to go to be at the level of the best women's tennis players. I have to be honest about that," she said. That is a rare statement from a 20-year-old with a stadium full of people believing she can do anything. That level of self-awareness is not coached, it's character. The distinction that matters, and it is a critical one, is the difference between honest assessment and erasure, between identifying gaps in a player's game and suggesting that the reaction to her achievements is manufactured rather than earned. Eala did not ask for a phenomenon. She created results, and results created a response. The question of whether that response sometimes overstates her current level is legitimate. The suggestion that her rise is primarily cultural rather than competitive is something else entirely. She started 2025, ranked 138th in the world. She ended it ranked 50th. That is not a social media trend. That is work. Strip away the headlines. Set aside the Twitter arguments and the clipped quotes and the think pieces about legacy and generational transfer. This story is actually about a sport at an inflection point, trying to decide what it wants to be. Tennis spent decades being watched by a relatively narrow global audience dominated by European and American markets. The stars were European and American. The coverage was European and American. The assumptions about who the sport was for and who it should develop, those were shaped by institutions built in a particular era. That era is ending, not collapsing, ending gradually and irreversibly. New fans from new markets are arriving. They are not passive watchers. They are organized, emotionally invested, and culturally connected to the players who represent them. They follow closely, they travel, they sell out venues, they move ticket markets. The referee in Dubai, who'd spent decades courtside at the highest level of the sport, said it plainly. Some of the largest markets in the world have unrealized potential in tennis. All they need is players who show up and establish themselves. And Eala has done that. That is not a problem. Tennis needs to manage. That is exactly what tennis needs. Coco Gauff said it after her win against Eala in Dubai. "I want to thank Alex for bringing a new demographic to this sport. I'm very thankful for it. I think it's great." Think about that. Gauff beat her 6-0, 6-2 that day, and still, she acknowledged the gift Eala was giving the game. Jessica Pegula described Eala as the ideal role model. The way she's been able to fill stadiums and the way her country supports her is something special. She handles it with such poise and maturity, Pegula said. The players who share a court with her see it clearly. They understand what she represents not just for Filipino tennis but for the sport's future capacity to reach people it has never reached before. When Rafael Nadal, a man who has never sought controversy for its own sake, who has consistently deflected away from conflict and toward the game itself, publicly and unambiguously stands in someone's corner, it means something. He did not simply defend a student, he made an argument about what tennis should value. He said, without saying it directly, that the gatekeepers of the sport cannot claim to want a bigger, more diverse, more globally connected tennis community, and then treat the arrival of exactly that as a threat to the established order. You cannot invite everyone to watch and then complain when everyone shows up. That is the central tension in this story. And Nadal, in his characteristically quiet and precise way, named it. He chose the court over the podium, the practice session over the press statement, the person over the politics. And in doing so, he made his position unmistakable. Alexandra Eala is ranked in the top 50 in the world. She has beaten 3 Grand Slam champions in a single tournament run. She is 20 years old. João Fonseca is one of the most gifted young players in the men's game. He is 18. His best tennis is entirely ahead of him. Roger Federer will be inducted into the International Tennis Hall of Fame in 2026, cementing a legacy that doesn't need anyone's defense. Rafael Nadal returned to a tennis court after a year away and handed the racket, metaphorically speaking, to the future he has spent years quietly building. And the sport itself is being asked a question that has nothing to do with rankings or sponsorship deals or media coverage ratios. It's being asked whether it can accommodate what it's becoming, whether the institutions that shape modern tennis can expand to include the new crowds, the new fans, the new countries bringing their flags and their phones and their uncontainable belief in players who look like them. The answer that question gets will determine more about the next 20 years of this sport than any single match result. Here is what we want you to think about, and we genuinely want your answer in the comments. Is Alexandra Eala the most important player in tennis right now? Not the best, the most important, because those are 2 completely different designations, and the gap between them is where this entire story lives. The best player wins the most matches. The most important player changes what the sport means and who it belongs to. And sometimes the most important player comes along precisely when the sport needs that kind of disruption, not to break the game but to open it. We want to know what you think. Does Nadal have every right to stand in Eala's corner the way he did? Did Federer cross a line, or was he raising a legitimate concern in an inelegant way? And where do you stand on what tennis is becoming? Drop your answer below. Subscribe if you haven't already. Hit the bell so you don't miss what comes next in this story, because it is far from over. The match is still in progress.